Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the U.S. is ready to restart strikes in Iran if there is no deal between the two countries. In a speech in Singapore, Hegseth also took some swipes at NATO allies. Speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue, he talked about the Middle East, U.S. partnerships, and China's military expansion.
There is rightful alarm regarding China's historic military buildup and the expansion of its military activities in the region and beyond. We share a clear-eyed assessment of that security environment and a mutual understanding that a Pacific dominated by any hegemon would unravel the regional balance of power and undermine the equilibrium we all seek to preserve. The Department of War is working with the utmost focus to prevent any such unraveling. We do not approach this challenge with needless confrontation, but with a posture of measured and deliberate strength.
On the sidelines of that important security and defense summit is our colleague Haslinda Amin, who is a Bloomberg editor-at-large and the host of Insight with Haslinda Amin on Bloomberg Television. Haslinda, always great to speak with you, and I wonder if you could set the scene for us first. Maybe pick up on what the Defense Secretary said there and how that's coloring the proceedings that are taking place in Singapore this weekend.
You heard from Hegseth himself. I mean, it is a balancing act. The tone that Hegseth adopted this time around reflects a relationship with China, which is still being redefined. He talked about how relations are constructive, that China is possibly a partner, and that communications between the two sides are open. In fact, the two militaries are in communication, and that is what is interesting here, David. When you speak to experts, they point to how relations between the two, till now, have been lacking in communication, and that's led to some big misunderstandings, prompting to that relationship being on the brink at some point. Case in point, back in October, when the U.S. imposed heightened tariffs, and that prompted China to retaliate by withholding critical minerals to the U.S., bringing the U.S. economy to its knees. Now, that's because of a lack of communication, and I think the U.S. and China are trying to rectify that. If you take a look at what happened in Beijing just 2 weeks ago, we had President Trump, before leaving Beijing after that summit, telling Xi Jinping, you know what, call me maybe if there are issues between the two sides. It is an attempt to redefine that relationship, and communications are pretty much key. And you know what? It is interesting to note as well that the Pew Research recently stated what the Americans themselves think about China. They no longer think of China as an enemy, as a foe. They see China as a rival. They can coexist. And perhaps this is that defining moment.
Haslinda, it's so nice to finally get to talk to you. This is the first time I've gotten the opportunity since joining the team here. But I do want to ask you a little bit more about Hegseth before we kind of broaden out a little bit, because in this Q&A, he was also asked about future arms sales to Taiwan and if he was able to do that. There's been reporting that those stockpiles are low, and that so there's two ways to look at this. It's either being used as a bargaining chip, as the president said, or it's being put on hold because those stockpiles are low and the U.S. will need them. What was his response, and how is that playing out at the forum?
First of all, I want to say that Taiwan is the red line in relations between the U.S. and China. Taiwan, that China has warned time and time again that if it is mismanaged, that could be severe consequences. So Taiwan really is the red line. The fact that Hegseth's speech did not mention Taiwan at all, that is a big deal, because if you recall, back in his speech a year ago, this time last year in Shanghai, he talked about Taiwan. He mentioned Taiwan 5 times. This time around, no mention of Taiwan, even though Taiwan is the key issue for the world today. It was only during the Q&A when he was asked about that deal, that arms deal, which, China took issue with, that he said, you know what? President Trump will decide on that. That in itself is a reflection of how sensitive he is to the topic of Taiwan. So I think the fact that he refused to answer that question says everything.
You, of course, are watching all of the proceedings. You are participating in them as well. You're doing interviews on the sidelines here, and you spoke to NATO's military chief a little bit earlier today. And yes, the focus is very much on the Indo-Pacific, but also on Europe. There are a lot of European security and defense officials there as well. And you asked him about the relationship between the U.S. and NATO. Let's take a little bit of a listen to the colloquy that you had with the NATO military chief.
In the speech by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War of the U.S., he talked about how there are great benefits for allies that help themselves. It seems to be a dig for Europe and NATO. How do you assess what's been relayed by Pete Hegseth?
Well, this is nothing new. We had a message loud and clear a long time ago. I think that we react. We had a commitment, a strong commitment in The Hague to reach 5% by 2035. We are on that path. We are progressing on that. We are just doing it. We have a NATO defense planning process to give us the capability that we need, and we will acquire that in time. So I think we are in a good shape. And of course, we as a military side, we don't have any drama going on.
Big Cavo Dragon there. Haslinda, put that into a broader context again. The focus here among those allies still very much on President Trump's call for these European nations to contribute larger percentage of their GDP to defense. How much is that being talked about at this forum thus far?
You know what? The NATO military chief was pretty plain and clear. He talked about how they are listening to the U.S. They are bringing that defense spending up to 5%. It won't happen overnight. It will take time, but they are getting there. They have listened, and they know their commitment. I think that's one. The other thing he talked about was how the relationship between the U.S. and NATO is mature. It's stable, and it will go through all these challenges, and it is adapting to the current challenges and the current time. And I think that's key. I think you need to draw that comparison with the relationship that the U.S. has with this part of the world, the Indo-Pacific, which is very much reliant on the U.S. for, I guess in a way, for lack of a better expression, protection. I mean, with the China's buildup in this part of the world, it is only a U.S.-led alliance, a U.S.-led response that can counter the defense. But in any case, I think the point to note really is the U.S. can't do anything alone. It requires NATO in Europe. It requires, the partners in this part of the world to actually counter that buildup that we see from China right now.
Certainly an argument NATO allies have been making pretty strongly to the White House. Haslinda, quickly before we let you go, there is news that the New York Times has kicked out, China has kicked out the New York Times long-standing, very accomplished China reporter Vivian Wang after that outlet did an interview with a separate reporter with the president of Taiwan. Historically, China's been pretty tolerant of Taiwanese officials doing media outlet interviews, especially with American outlets. Does this mark a change? Is China cracking down, and is it concerning that this is coming on the heels of that Trump-Xi summit?
Well, it's really hard to say what really is happening because it's hard to say what U.S. policy is towards Taiwan right now. I think there is a reassessment of how the U.S. views Taiwan. Some people view that under this current administration, the Taiwan issue is no longer a key issue in America's policy towards China. There are other bigger issues that it needs to handle. So it's really hard to say whether the crackdown is continuing and how, the world should be responding. I think there's a lack of clarity, and we just have to wait and see what the actual policy is towards Taiwan.